Hi, welcome to Geek Moniker. I'm Yusuf.
Hi, I'm John. What do you have for us today, Yusuf?
So, John, one of my hobbies is miniature painting, and here's an example of that. It's a work in progress. As you can see, it's a really tiny model, and painting these things can be quite intricate. And if you really want to, get the best quality out of your skills, you need the best tools, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So basically, the act of painting these is taking a little bit of paint and applying it onto the model. There are two main ways to apply it to the model. One is an airbrush, which is a mechanical sprayer, or more commonly, just a paintbrush, like this guy right here. And specifically, I'm going to talk today about the high-end tools, the high-end paintbrushes that exist in this world. Go ahead, John.
Why would you use one of these paintbrushes over, say, something I would get at the dollar store? What's kind of the main advantage there?
So definitely there are few characteristics that these paintbrushes have over any other, cheaper or dollar store, standard brand. Before we get into that, maybe let's jump into the anatomy of a brush so we can, ground ourselves. If you look at the brush right here, you have three major parts. You have the bristles up front, you have the metal ferrule, and you have the handle back here. By far, the bristles are the most important and critical part of the brush. There are two main categories of bristles, the synthetic bristles or the natural hair bristles. Synthetic bristles are just man-made materials, plastics and those type. And synthetic natural hair are, actual animal hair. They can be horse hair, badger hair, boar hair, or in this particular case, for the really high-end brushes, Kolinsky sable hair, which is a type of Siberian weasel. And what the brush I'm going to focus on today is called the Winsor Newton Series 7 brush. This has a lot of history. It was actually commissioned by Queen Victoria in the 1800s from Winsor Newton. And it is considered by far to be the world's best watercolor brush. And generally in this class, the world's best brush. There are brands that do make comparable brushes as well, but you wouldn't be wrong to consider this like one of the best brushes in the world. And so coming back to your point on what makes this a great brush over any other brush is it's the characteristic of the hair. So in this case, the Kolinsky sable hair is spectacular. Like it maintains a point. I don't know if you can see, but that's a really sharp point. And it retains that point as you paint as well. Most of the cheaper brushes you buy, they won't even start out looking like this. And as soon as you start painting, the hairs tend to spread apart, which obviously does not give you the detail that you really want. There are two other characteristics of these hairs that are very important.
Maybe I could ask on that real quick. The hair spreading out, is that due to them not being cared for properly, or is that kind of normal wear and tear?
It can be a combination. So even these brushes will tend to spread and fray and wear out over time. But generally they start out very good and they retain their characteristics for a lot longer if you take care of them. There is a tendency of these brushes, because the types of hair and the size of hair that they use, they tend to form a point and stick naturally to that point. Whereas, the synthetic hairs have a different structure to them, so they tend to not form that point as well. Two other characteristics that are really important to painters is one, the springiness of the hair. So basically, if you push it against the surface, how far it springs back. If it's too soft or too hard, that's not great. Like if it's too floppy, paint's going to go all over the place. You don't have control. Similarly with if it's too hard, you're not going to get the nice stroke you want. The third characteristic that makes these brushes really good is the ability to store paint in the body, the belly of the bristles, and to let it flow out. So that's important too. You don't want to be, continuously going back to your palette and picking up paint a little bit at a time, right? So, and when you want to paint, you want the paint to nicely flow out, like, from a fine pen, a similar characteristic. So those are the three characteristics that are really good about this brush or this class of brush.
So yeah, you mentioned a class of brush. Now there are a few comparable brushes, it sounded like. Why does this one really stick out among those other fine brushes?
You know, this is, I guess this is the name brand for sure. You know, it's been around for like almost 200 years. It's been considered one of the best brushes all along that time. Even the ones that you get today, you know, it's brand name. There are other companies that make similar brushes, similar hairs. They use the same hair. It's quality control. It's expectation. It's, you know, the feel. But, you know, I do have another brush. This is the Raphael 8404, which is also considered a very good. You can notice it with this little orange tip right here.
Oh yeah.
It's considered a really good miniature painter's brush. You know, similar level to the Winsor Newton Series 7.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things with this brush is because they are a specialty brush, they're not very commonly bought, and they're quite expensive comparatively to other brushes. You can't find them everywhere. It's kind of hard to find them. The Winsor Newton are a British brand, so, you know, supply, I think, is generally limited. And also another thing that you need to take care of when trying to buy one of these brushes is that because they're so expensive compared to other brushes, they tend to be a lot of fake. So you definitely do not want to be buying, you know, from untrusted sources. So, and
Okay.
I'll put a link in the description of the video to the place I bought it from. You know, I had very good luck. They definitely look legitimate. And, you know, I would think if you want to go buy one, try to buy it from a reputable art store. I'm sure they have, you know, a strong supply chain and they can guarantee the, you know, the product that you're buying.
Are there any ways to spot a fake? Like if I handed you a brush.
I mean, it depends on the quality of brush and, you know, what they're using. They could be using Kolinsky sable hair as well, but they could be using it from different parts of the, you know, tail. They could be, the quality of the hairs could be lower. So, you know, one of the things you are paying for from these really expensive brushes is the quality control. Like I think, you know, some manufacturers only use the last 1/3 part of the tail hairs from like the male weasel. You know, it's those type of things that make the best tool, right? You get into these
Gotcha.
very specific characteristics and production, you know, scenarios.
Interesting.
Yeah. And, you know, to talk about price also, one of the interesting things about this hobby and this particular tool is that although it is relatively very expensive compared to, you know, a standard synthetic store brush, like probably 10, 20 times more, it's still only about $25. Right? Which makes it quite accessible to people. In most hobbies, if you're looking to buy, you know, top of the line tools, they can be quite inaccessible. They could be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. But in this hobby, you can actually buy, you know, the world's best brush for about 25 bucks. They do wear down, and, you know, considering how much you paint, it could, you know, become a little expensive, but it's still not inaccessible.
And if this is a good time for me maybe to ask a few other related questions.
Sure, go ahead.
So you're talking about the brush. Are there special paints that you should match to it to ensure the best quality?
So that's actually quite interesting. These Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes are actually a watercolor brush. But almost exclusively the paints that you use on miniature models today are acrylic paints. And generally, you know, I think you would use a different type of brush, probably synthetic brushes for acrylic painting. But because of the way we paint these miniature models, like the paint is super diluted and, you know, it's very flowy, these watercolor brushes actually are quite a good option for painting these models.
Okay, very nice. And if I was kind of a novice painter, you know, just kind of starting, would I appreciate this brush? Like how far along would I need to be before I would consider using a brush of this caliber?
So I think getting into something, you're going to be in a position where you need to achieve a certain level of skill before the characteristics of these premium tools kick in. I mean, and I think that's true among any hobby. I wouldn't say buy the cheapest brush when you're starting out, buy maybe a mid-range brush. There are a lot of recommendations out there for this hobby. Get a little basic skills in place and then go to this brush. Like definitely I have seen a considerable step up in my painting skill using these brushes. But I have a few years of painting behind me. I mean, you could start even quicker, like within a few months of painting, and hopefully you'll see what the brush brings to your hobby. And not to say that you can do a similar job with synthetic brushes. Like I know some pro level painters who actually use almost exclusively the cheap store brand synthetic brushes. But I think their skill level transcends any limitations of the tool. So they're able to do it.
Nice. Now I have to ask too. So you may or may not be aware that one of the things that I do with my chip security work is sometimes I have to paint very, very fine masks on the chips. And the way that I do that is I use a single hair brush basically. And once I get to that very, very fine level of detail, I basically have to take very special precautions to make sure that the brush doesn't dry out. Do you encounter anything like that in your work to get those very, very fine details?
So that's actually interesting because most people think, especially on these tiny little models, that using a much tinier brush helps, and that's not necessarily true. Uh, with these with these brushes, you see the point is extremely fine. So when you use the point, you are able to get that level of detail, but it has a big belly. And what the big belly does is it retains the paint and lets it flow. So you can, do a lot more painting and still get a very sharp line that you want. So I would actually suggest you try this. Get a nice high quality brush with a sharp point and a big belly, and then you'll find out that it doesn't dry out as much. And that's something that, I think as you start painting, experience shows you, and people tend to move to bigger and bigger brushes over time.
Oh, okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. Interesting. And now I was also wondering too, in part because there's several of these high-end brushes, are there maybe different circles that prefer different brands? Like maybe you're a miniature painting for say 40K and people like one style brush. Maybe if you did model train layouts, maybe you'd prefer a different style brush. Do you see any sort of cultural divides like that? For in different circles, maybe people like different brushes.
No, I actually haven't noticed that as much. I think, this class of brush is very popular and very capable. And I think, people use these brushes all over the place. The one thing I would say is that some people tend to paint miniatures to, uh, paint their armies when they play for a wargaming game like 40K. And so they're not as concerned about getting a high level of detail. They're more concerned about just making the armies look nice and playing the game. So in that case, you may not actually need brushes of this caliber because you're being a little more, you know, coarse with your painting rather than fine painting. So in that's where I would say maybe you choose a different caliber and price range of brush rather than different type of brush per se.
Nice. Let's see. I think those were the main questions that I had. Maybe one thing was about, so you have one shape of tip there, but with my limited experience of brushes, sometimes you maybe have a flatter tip versus a pointier tip. Do you still get that?
Yes,
Okay,
Uh, and I do have an example of this. So this is not a Kolinsky sable. This is a cheap brush. And as you can see, it's kind of a flat head brush. They do
sure.
have their place, if you want to do large swaths of paint. Generally, these Kolinsky sables come in this particular design. And I think it's because the way the hairs like to set and which gives you that sharp point. They don't tend to be, like the flat brushes.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
What about the ergonomics of the handle? Do you see a lot of innovation in that? Or is it pretty much considered that straight handle is kind of the way to go?
Um, I think I've only seen straight handles, and straight round handles are very common, like you see here. The one thing
Sure.
I have noticed that there are some brands that have flat sides, so they have like a flat triangular side to their brush, and I actually find that to be quite nice. Like, having the flat sides kind of gives you the place to hold and turn it around. But generally, handles tend to be fairly straight and, round.
Nice. Well, I think those are probably my main questions. Do you have anything else you might want to add?
No, I think, I've covered the basics. There's a lot of great content regarding these brushes, specific background and techniques and things. I definitely um, encourage people to go look out there. I think I might put a link to a short, like 10-minute documentary regarding the Winsor Newton brushes. That was really nice. Gives you a good overview of how they manufactured and the skill level that actually is required to manufacture these. They have like hundreds of years of accumulated experience among the people who manufacture these brushes by hand. So it's quite a fascinating world out there.
Well, that sounds great. And I'd also like to point out, we don't have so much a question as our first comment. Shout out to Peter, who says hello to us. So
Hey,
hi,
Peter,
Peter.
how's it going?
Let me check real quick if we have any other comments on Facebook or Twitter. I don't think I see any. So I think with that, this is probably a good stopping point to add links then, if that sounds good to you.
Sounds good, John.
All
Till
right,
next time.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. Maybe we'll see you next week. All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.